This is Bhikkhu Anālayo. My topic is early Buddhist orality and the challenges of memory. And this is my presentation to the 11th section on Buddhist literature at the 19th IAPS conference. And the starting point for this presentation originally was a study more specifically of two Pali collections, the Udana and the Atthakavagga, in the light of their parallels, and trying to relate that to research in psychology on memory. This has been published in the meantime. The main point I was originally intending to make in my presentation, and which I'll make in this article, is about the relationship between source text and commentary. What makes the Udana and the Atthakavagga interesting is that in some transmission lineages, these exist just as verse text, and in others they exist as verse together with the narratives that purport to explain how these verses were spoken, what motivated them. And I was looking at that from the perspective of research in cognitive psychology on the way memory works, in particular how sometimes there can be a tendency of misattributing the source of a particular memory. A typical example, they do these exercises where they give us a few words, say bed, rest, lie down, and we are asked to remember these words. And then after a little time, we are shown a list of words, and we have to say whether these were in the original listing. And one of the words we are asked to identify is sleep. Now, actually, sleep was not part of the list earlier. But for many of us, what happens is we feel certain sleep was part of that list because that's the association our mind called up. When we hear bed, rest, lie down, we think, oh, this is about sleeping. Even though the idea this is about sleeping is just an association we have, a little while later we actually feel certain sleep was in that list. And this finding in cognitive psychology is a very convenient way for us to understand how in the process of oral transmission, the distinction between the source, this is the actual text, and another source, this is my association, could get blurred. And how ideas and textual portions that originate from a commentary in the course of oral transmission could eventually become part of the text itself. Of course, the question of commentary is just one aspect of the dynamics of orality. So that was my original presentation. And in the meantime, there have been a number of publications. So I wanted to briefly just present them. The first one is Brian Levman. All of these publications are related to study of orality, and gives me a lot of happiness to see that there is so much interest now in this topic. And he goes for what he calls the sonic dimension of Pali, the aesthetics of Pali. And then another one by Sarah Shaw, The Art of Listening. Already the title gives us foregrounds, what is so central in orality. It's about listening. And she studies several discourses in the Digha Nikaya from the perspective of their literary dimensions. Then Eviata Schulman, Visions of the Buddha. And this is one publication where I think is problematic. And I have already published a detailed criticism. And I don't want to go into detail now. This is a discussion that we will continue. He will reply to my criticism, and then I will reply again. So that discussion can be done in the written and does not need to come in here now. I just need to mention it because his take on the importance of memory, memorization, tools to help in memorization is diametrically the opposite to mine. And in this talk, this is the main topic, the main point I want to make, the importance for us to take into account human memory and its limitations. Then Mark Allen, he has worked a lot on Gandhari manuscript culture. We are really indebted to him for his excellent scholarship. And he brings that perspective from working with manuscripts to bear on trying to assess early Buddhist orality. And the latest is my own early Buddhist oral tradition, where I've been trying to identify the main patterns or rules of orality, and to try to come to something of a vision of how we should consider these texts. There are two main interpretation models. One is improvisation. Usually the idea is there's an early period of free improvisation, and after that the texts become more stable. The problem is that the evidence of change we have for early Buddhist texts is continuous. We can see change happening early and also in later times. This makes it improbable and unconvincing to assume change only happened in the early period. And the model of improvisation does not really help us to understand the similarities. The challenge we have with these texts is there are so many differences and so many similarities. How to bring these two aspects together? Another model, and that is perhaps the most common model, assumes intentional change. The idea that all the variations we see between texts transmitted by parallel transmission lineages should be attributed to intentional change. The problem with that is, again, the evidence. The evidence we have shows that there are so many variations or changes that just don't make sense, that are really errors. There's not some kind of evident or even imaginable reason. Why would somebody have changed it that way? It makes no sense. The text no longer functions in the way it should. So intentional change as the main modality is also, in my view, not really convincing. And the problem throughout that I see is that we are all prone to look through the lenses of the world of textual composition with which we are familiar. The idea of an early period of fluctuation and then followed by a period of stabilization. This is what we all experience when we write, no? Writing an article, writing a book. At the beginning, we have everything is free. We start here, there, change around, slowly and slowly become stable. And then we give it to the publisher, and from that time onwards, it becomes static. And the idea of intentional change is, of course, also what we experience, even though sometimes the editors may make changes that are against our intention, but it's their intention. No? So whatever changes my article, my book goes through, all of these changes are intentional. Since my experiences of intention affecting change, I naturally suspect that whenever I come across change. And there I fail to give full room to the fact that the oral tradition is based on substantially different ways of textual production. It cannot be compared to what we are doing nowadays. And the problem is in part also because of the type of terminology we use. First, Sangiti becomes the first counsel. Sangiti doesn't mean counsel. It means communal recitation. Or the people who are transmitting these texts, they are bhanakas. We have that word even in inscriptions. A bhanaka is not an editor, is not a redactor. When we use words like the editors, the redactors, we are importing a whole cluster of ideas from the world of textual production with which we are familiar into an area where they don't fit. These are bhanakas, these are reciters. I think it is quite important for us to adopt the appropriate terminology to help us step out of projecting onto this material from our own personal experiences as writers in the modern time. And that stepping out is challenging, I agree. I'm still struggling with it. And at first sight, it may seem that this oral transmission is just erratic. But if we give it the time and do really look at the mechanics, and this is what I was trying to do in my book, we can see there are patterns. It's not just erratic. It's just different from what we are used to. And I can share from my own experience, happened recently, inspired by a remark by Peter Skilling. I started to study abbreviation. How does abbreviation work? How does it work in this collection? How does it work in that collection? And I wrote, I think, 3 articles on abbreviation. And by studying abbreviation and really coming to understand how it operates, I had to revise a position I had taken earlier about a topic that is quite relevant, quite important in a way, the relationship of the Four Noble Truths to the Buddha's awakening. And I had taken a position on that I needed to revise, because at that time, when I took that position, I was not really aware of the working mechanics of abbreviation, how it works, how it is applied. And though I took intentional abbreviation as a ready-made excuse, and I had to change that idea. This just shows as an example to show how giving the time to understand these mechanics of orality, repetition, waxing syllables, abbreviation, commentary and source text, and memory, it's all in the mind. It really pays off. You know, if I could take you all and teleport you to ancient India, say 100 years after the Buddha, whenever he would have lived. No texts. No text to look at or compare, just memory. If we want to know any, I don't know, Mula Pariyaya Sutta, have to find, first of all, a Majjhima Bhanika, somebody who has memorized the collection. Then we have to see, has he time, or she, if it's a woman. And then they have to recite. And even at the time of recitation, we just get the present moment of the text. And unless we remembered what happened earlier, it will already be lost. We can't go from the beginning, check the end. It's all in the mind. And the attempt to transmit depends on memory, on training in memory, on all these different tools they use to strengthen memory. So it's more, even we could think of it as textual potentialities rather than actual texts. And when we look at it from the perspective of memory, then all these different patterns, they suddenly make sense. And we come to a better appreciation of the type of texts that we are dealing with, the early Buddhist discourses. And that is the foundation for assessing what is early Buddhism. And this is not in any way about reconstructing some kind of original. Impossible. The sources at our disposal do not allow us to say with certainty, so and so said such and such a thing 2,500 years ago. Can't do that. But we can develop a historical perspective. We can say this is earlier and this is later. And earlier and later are not about value judgments. Early is good, later is bad, or other way around. It's about a historical perspective, about understanding how things developed. Look, this idea came up, and then it went into this, and it came to that. And this is how this whole thing started. Because early Buddhism is the common heritage and starting ground of all the different Buddhist traditions. And for us to understand the development of Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist meditation practice, whatever it is, we need to understand how it started, where it came from, how it developed. And this is the potential of comparative study of the early Buddhist discourses. And this potential requires keeping in mind memory. And at the present stage, it requires also being able to access all the relevant texts. This means not just Pali, but also Chinese and Tibetan. And with the development of machine translation, hopefully in the near future, the Chinese text will be available even to those who do not speak Chinese. But for the time being, for research on early Buddhism, we do need all the philological expertise to be able to access these texts, which for the most part have not been translated in their original. This is what I had to say about early Buddhist orality and the challenges of memory. Thank you for your attention.